Welcome to the Possible Creative Podcast, where we talk with smart creative people doing smart creative work, which inspires others like you to pursue your own smart creative work. If you want to be more creative or bring your creative work to the next level, this podcast is for you, whether it's music, game dev, film, writing, art, dance, or any other expression of yourself. On this podcast, I invite people who will inspire you, break your self-limiting beliefs, give you permission to pursue your creative vision, and to do it at the best of your ability. I'm your host, Patrick Wayne. Hi. Thanks for listening or watching, whichever you're doing. Today on this episode, JDC, writer of Conceptual Heist. It's a science fiction, jazzpunk, art heist webcomic. This webcomic is entering its 7th year, I think that's correct, and features beautiful art of the current artist, Jenny Godin. And you can learn more at conceptualheist.tumblr.com or on Instagram at JDICI. On Instagram. You should also use this moment and tumble over to the subscribe button, smash it, or hit that thumbs up button. That tells the algorithm to recommend this to other people like you who are going to enjoy it. And once this podcast crosses 1,000 subscribers, I'm going to sing the intro on the following episode. So I'm waiting. Go ahead. Hit the subscribe button. I'm not too proud to ask. Help us out. I really appreciate it. But today, Jay, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Just going to add in that actually probably one of the easiest places to read Conceptual Heist these days is also Webtoons, which is the biggest app for webcomics these days. And we're starting to set up and actually publish things in Webtoons format, but everything is available over on Webtoons if you want to read it on your phone.
That's great.
Easily.
Very cool. Yeah, that obviously makes it easier. That I feel like most of my comic consumption is now through apps.
Yes, it's disturbing, and especially since I have a stack of graphic novels beside my bed that's actually even with my bed now.
Well, you haven't exactly had conventions to promote or sell these things at the last year, so.
No, that's just my reading pile that keeps growing.
Okay. Yeah. That takes up a lot of space.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I'm for the same reason. I just tend to like declutter. And so you said Webtoons, right?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. You can check out Conceptual Heist on there. First question, what is jazzpunk?
Jazzpunk was basically an idea that I was sort of kicking around for a few years. It was the idea of just sort of cyberpunk tech, but with 1920s jazz age sort of fashion and design feel to it. Mm-hmm. I just sort of figured by the year 2090 that would have come back around, and the original idea was just very much the same thing as what you see in the first cover. Gemma in a sort of flapper tassely style dress with the hat and everything, but she had a ray gun. But when we actually started coming up with the series, I sort of felt that no, I didn't want her to be using guns in this series at all. There is actually a scene in the first chapter where she uses a gun, but she has a gun pointed at a guy's head, and when he goes to attack, she flips the gun around and hits him with the butt end. She will not fire a gun during this series. That's actually one of my rules, and I will then proceed to ignore the fact that I managed to throw out one of my other rules, my second rule for the series in the last chapter, in that Gemma was not going to have any relationships during this whole thing.
Well, I mean, better to find love than shooting guns, I guess.
Yeah. Well, it's actually, because of the story, it was a situation where I had one thing planned, and then I was talking to my friend who's also edits the series for me, and I was just sort of shooting story around. I'm like, I said, instinctively, I'm like, I want a relationship to sort of start here, but should I? Because that doesn't, I really want to stay away from it. Mm-hmm. He's like, yeah, I know you want to stay away from it, but it is the worst possible decision she could make at that moment, which makes it the best possible decision for the story.
Mm-hmm.
I was very annoyed that he was right, because it's very rare a good story starts with a good decision.
It's true.
Yeah,
Typically it's a bad decision that causes a series of events, and then
most of anybody's best stories start with them doing something incredibly stupid.
well, that's also human, right? Despite our
Yes.
best intentions, we make the worst choice.
Yes.
Help me understand where. So, I don't know. Before Conceptual Heist, had you published anything else, or is this your first?
This was my first major one.
Okay.
I had another webcomic that was running for a few months called The Unfinding of Erasmus Civitatum, which after that died, a friend of mine sort of said, well, if you're not going to be able to continue it as a comic, why don't you write it as a novel? I sat down, spent 4 or 5 months writing it as a novel, finished it, was very proud of myself for knowing that I could actually sit down and write a complete novel. And while I was doing the second draft, realized I did not, well, through the process, I did not like writing novels at all. I find it very isolating, and with comics, with the way I write, I tend to be something of a deadline writer. I'm most comfortable writing when I like laying track right in front of the train.
I get it. Yeah.
And which is not always the best way to do it. Sometimes you do a lot better when you're thinking much farther ahead. It's just I tend to be at my most productive and get myself well ahead of things when I'm like, oh, I have to finish writing this page and get it edited by the end of the day, so that when the artist gets home tonight and Jenny wants to start working on the page, it's edited and ready, and she won't be yelling at me that she has to change word balloons next week. Because that's happened, and Jenny does not like it when she has to change the lettering.
For sure. Yeah, it changes the composition of the shot potentially.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. Yeah, I think that a lot of people who struggle to get work done, if put in an environment where they have to do it, will actually do it. And when you work with an artist, or you have some sort of another team relying on you by a certain date, it's a great motivator to actually do the work.
Oh yeah, that was part of it. That, like, because I'd have that feedback, because I could send things, and I've had it that, like, both Jenny, Matt, Phil, and Liam, the 4 artists I've worked with, and I have another artist I'm working on a project that hasn't been announced yet. All of them have, at some point or other, sort of said, this is not good script. You need to tighten this up. And when an artist is telling you you're not writing well, you're writing really shittily. And while I'm writing a novel, I'm sitting there and I'm 100 pages in, and I have had no feedback on the writing at that point, and it starts making me nervous, because I'm like, am I writing terribly, or am I writing something halfway decent?
It's interesting. I think a lot of new artists will start with, I'm going to go write a novel, I'm going to go do a whole album, I'm going to go build a whole video game. And while there's value in that process, early on, as you develop, as you get your feet under you, it feels like it's more advantageous to do shorter, easier, quicker things, where the feedback cycles are faster.
So much easier. It's great when you're standing there and you have this great big epic story, but every epic story starts with 5 pages. Get those 5 pages done. And when you're done those 5 pages, worry about the following 3. And especially if you're writing comics, if I'm not hooked by page 3, I'm probably gonna bail. By page 3, if I'm not jumping at it, you have maybe 2-3 more pages to hold me, and then I'm gonna walk.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't want to spend a ton of time trying to hook somebody in with just a great big world building sequence. World building is the worst place to start in writing.
Mm-hmm.
You start with the story, you start with the characters, you make sure those things build together. After that, then you hit certain points in the story, like opening of chapter 2 of Conceptual Heist. Gemma drops off lunch to a homeless man. And one of the characters is like, I remember when you could give them cash. And she's like, well, not many of us are that old anymore because it's so far ahead in the future. It's a cashless society, so you can't just give a homeless person some change. So how are they going to survive? They have to beg for food. Mm-hmm. Literally, you have to go get food and give it to them for them to be able to eat. And it was just because I want to. There is a bit of a play in the series about the difference between the rich and the poor. I don't get into that super deeply, but there is aspects to it hinted at throughout the whole series. Part of the problem is that Gemma herself is a rich person, and it's a mistake I made in creating the character and where things sat. It's my own writing mistake, but because it's already established in the series, I got to run with it, so I run with it and play with it that way. And it's I remember a musician friend of mine saying that when you're playing bass and reggae, once you make a mistake, you have to keep playing that mistake because the mistake is now the right way of playing it.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, I think jazz has something similar too, where if you're improvising something and it's just kind of off, you just run with it. You just make it work. I think that's really interesting.
Stay with the mistake. Figure out to work around the mistake. It's fun because you can either spend a ton of time explaining it away, or you just this is how it works.
Or you conveniently strip the character or whatever you didn't like, and then it just feels like, well, why did it matter in the first place? It feels irrelevant at that point. Help me understand. So I think it's really interesting that you went straight to self-publishing. You just decided, I'm going to do it for myself. I'm going to publish my own stuff. What was it like taking a step to publishing your first thing, launching your first Kickstarter? Like, how do you get to a point where you're like, okay, I'm ready to share this? I never stop to think whether or not I should or shouldn't. I just do. I will happily jump into part of my creative process is finding an artist, taking them by the hand and say, hey, come with me, and then proceed to jump off a cliff. And while they're looking at me in terror, I'm like, now we get to build an airplane. Yeah. That was actually another question, is how do you, like, because you're the first person I talked to, I think, that has pulled in like someone that works as closely with them through the process. I mean, how do you, especially if you don't have a budget, how do you, like, is it just a straight enthusiasm play? Like, how do you rope someone into helping you out?
Well, it's about building the relationship. With Conceptual Heist, when it was built, Matt Gagnon and we actually worked side by side with each other. And we had another coworker who worked on the other side of me, and the three of us were working on a team on a special project on the game that we were working on. And one day, our coworker, she said something about the two of us being such inspirations with our creative endeavors. And I turned around to Matt and I'm like, what do you do? Because I was working on my novel at the time. He's like, oh, I draw comics. And I'm like, really? Do you want to work together? No. I'm like, okay. Well, if you ever think, no. No problem. And for the next year, I sat next to him and, like, through some of the Image comic announcements, we just sat there refreshing web pages, looking at all these news announcements and just high-fiving the entire time and, like, having a blast. And we'd sit there, he'd be drawing something, and he was trying to figure out, at one point he was trying to figure out how to draw action sequences. I'm like, well, take a look at films. And I started showing him a bunch of great action sequences in films and, like, how the fight choreography worked, and started talking to him about how fight choreography works. And we started talking about comic theory and how to make sure that you were doing, it's the fun about comics is you have to make sure that you have to do enough work that the reader will do most of the work without you letting them in on the fact that they're doing most of the work.
Mm-hmm.
You have to give them just enough words and just enough action and just enough expression that going in that space between two panels, they do all the work. And just Matt and I talking together for about a year and a half. By the end of it, one day Matt and I were talking, and he said, we were talking about making comics, and I was sort of like, yeah, been wanting to do something like this. And he's like, well, that sounds kind of cool. I'm like, well, do you want to make a comic together? He's like, yeah. And I'm like, okay, let me think about it. And he said that in the morning at work. My girlfriend, now wife, called me that lunch hour, and she had just gone to the doctors because she hadn't been feeling well. There'd been something that had been screwing around with her system, and she didn't know. And she's like, I saw the doctor. I'm like, okay, I have some news. I'm like, all right. Are you ready? I'm like, I think so. She's like, I might be pregnant. I'm like, really? She's like, yeah. And finished lunch. I'm sitting there for the rest of the day with a giant smile on my face. And Matt's like, what's up? I'm like, just some stuff. And then I started and I sort of stopped. I'm like, oh crap, I'm gonna have a kid. I'm not gonna have time to make comics if I don't make them a thing now. Which is, people who know their comic book history, is exactly how Alan Moore started too. He found out that his girlfriend was pregnant, and realized that if he didn't start making comics, he never would. So he started making comics. I haven't hit his level yet, but I got back and I pitched the base idea of Conceptual Heist to Matt that day, and we started, and he'd ask me a question, I'd give him an answer. What does she look like? And I was like, well, she's beautiful, smart, suave, but she also has this snarky attitude, and, well, she's a thief, so she doesn't follow a lot of the standard social norms and beliefs. And I sort of like, yeah, but what does she look like? I'm like running through my head, and I have a friend who's an actress who is funny, smart, gorgeous, beautiful, suave, and so snarky. And she has this fantastic way of, she's this beautiful, demure, gorgeous woman, and she will turn the air blue at the drop of a hat in the most elegant way possible. And I was like, well, she looks like this. I pulled up a photo, and it was this new modeling shot that popped up right away. And I'm like, that's what she looks like. And Matt's like, you know her? I'm like, yeah, we're friends. It's like, she'll be cool with it? Totally. So he went home, drew some head sketches, and then I was like, okay, and I started writing the script. And the script starts off with, one second, now that I feel really bad as I'm about to try to quote it, I can't remember it off the top of my head. So I'll just pull up a comic copy of it. And it started off with, there are lots of ways to make money, but art theft is the only one that screws over people who deserve it. And part of the reason it was art theft was because it turns out that one of the top money-making earners in crime is actually art theft. And the added bonus is that only about 10% of art thefts are ever solved. So not only is it highly profitable, it's also a lot safer. So that, and Matt just bounced back and forth, and we made a deal that we owned it 50-50. It's a deal that I do a lot with my sort of personal creative projects. Is neither of us are going to get paid on this right off the top, but our ownership of it is between the two of us 50-50, and the artist earns 70% of the book's earnings. So for every dollar that comes in, they get 70 cents, I get 30. Which means I need to be making more comics than they do. But that's also fair because they put in about 70% of the time compared to my 30. So, because I write, they fight, they have to draw a fight scene.
That makes sense, yeah. Yeah, trying to find anything that's equitable is tough. At some point, you both have to trust the other person that, you know, you're doing the work. I love that you mentioned, you talk about the reader having to interpret between frames, and they do most of the work. And I think that understanding the power of the space in music and vocal delivery in music, what you don't show in a video game or what you don't allow them to interact with, you know, cinematics, the things you don't show, or like understanding like the key moments to convey the story, but leave space for the viewer, the listener, the reader to feel and interpret and impose himself in that space. I think that is a really mature and hard lesson to learn, because the natural inclination, I think, for new people is to try to like put everything in. That's one of my things. Like, people start talking about the world building in their story, and I don't care how the magic system works in your fantasy story. I want your fantasy story to be interesting. I had friends before the TV series were coming out. They're like, "Oh man, you gotta read this book, Game of Thrones. It's like, the series is fantastic." And I read like the first few pages and like the opening story about these guys. I'm like, it's snow zombies in fantasy world. My buddy's like, no man, it's so much more, so much more. Get to the end of the first chapter. I'm like, fine, I will get to the end of that first chapter. And the end of the first chapter is Jaime Lannister pushing Bran out a window. After you're reading it and you're like, oh, well, he's going to be the strong warrior guy. He's going to be the agile thief. She's going to be the smart one. And sort of everybody's falling into these standard tropes. And as soon as you're like, okay, I know what all the trope characters are, out the window, and, oh, this is something completely different. And trying to build into something that, because that series sort of like lets you build that world yourself. You build a lot more of that world in your own mind as it's going along before he goes and sits down and explains anything to you. And explaining things is the worst possible thing you can ever do.
The
Yeah.
Force is 1,000 times more interesting before Qui-Gon Jinn starts having Anakin measured for metachlorian count.
Mm-hmm.
The Force is a lot more interesting. That's just a mystical force controlling your destiny
Yeah.
compared to parasites.
Yeah. Yeah, I think in Game of Thrones, especially with the complicated relationships, there was space for me to interpret and impose my own experiences through the lens of those
Yeah.
relationships. And so
Yeah.
the way that I might interpret Tyrion's relationship with his family, the Lannisters, is different
Yeah.
based on my own relationship with my own family. And I
Yeah.
think creating some space for that and the complications is interesting. It's really
Yeah.
a great note. I know that you launched a Patreon, you've done a Kickstarter.
Yeah.
Those are pretty big drives where you're asking for money. And I know a lot of creatives struggle with that process of asking people for money. How do you kind of get over that? What helped you be able to feel like you could ask for financial return for your effort?
Well, it's not asking for money. It's saying buy my book. And that's what any tour, any musical tour is buy my album.
Mm-hmm.
Any book signing tour is buy my book.
Mm-hmm.
And buy my book is just give me money. But I have a book in exchange.
Right.
And that's very much what Kickstarter is. It's just buy the book, get the book.
Mm-hmm.
And if you buy this book, and you can convince other people to buy this book, then this book will definitely get made with Kickstarter. With Patreon, it's you think I'm doing something of value? If you think it's worth supporting, come support us.
Mm-hmm.
And if you support us, you get a bunch of stuff behind it. You get full process, you can go in and you can see things from script page to layouts to final pages design to just final inking, from script to fully inked and lettered.
If I'm an aspiring artist or an aspiring writer and I get to be invited into that process and see how that process works, that is a small price to pay to be to understand that process and see it play out.
Yeah.
And to be involved. I think that that's a real valuable thing. I also have this theory, I'm curious what you think, that up until Star Wars, nothing had monetized the IP like Star Wars had. Suddenly there were cereal boxes or lunch boxes and action figures and Star Wars everything. And I think that part of today's love of Star Wars is because people bought stuff and they filled their rooms with Star Wars and it became nostalgic, and there's some element of buy-in that generates further fandom, I think.
There's a yes, it was the first time it had been done to that level.
Mm-hmm.
Because remember, Star Wars happened because George Lucas couldn't get the rights to Buck Rogers.
Mm-hmm.
Or Flash Gordon. He couldn't get any of the old sci-fi serial stuff. And making a film about Dune is just an insanity. So he took all of that stuff, because that's what Jedis are. They're just Paul Atreides, but as a whole sect of the culture. With laser swords.
Mm-hmm.
And you just turn around and you get all this, and it just became this whole thing. But I mean, at the same time, you had John Carter, Conan, all those things had been floating around for ages as well. It's just nothing had happened as big as Star Wars. We had Batman toys before. You had Batman comics, Batman TV, Batman toys. It's just Star Wars went bigger. Mm-hmm. And it went bigger because George Lucas managed to hold on to the rights for all that. And he's like, well, I got to make some money somehow. He spent all of his life savings trying to make the movie. So I don't blame him on it. Mm-hmm. it's a matter of betting on yourself. And why wouldn't you bet on yourself?
Yeah. So that to me is the biggest question around anything creative. Like you are moved to do something, to make something.
Yeah.
We have very short lives. They're not
Yep.
long. Why would you not go make this thing?
Yeah.
You have one life. Just go make it.
Yeah.
Put it out.
And as an aside, Matt Gagnon left Conceptual Heist because comics are not easy. Comics are hard. And it's not a lot of reward for a lot of work for a lot of the time. Not everybody gets to be Robert Kirkman and bring home all the money. But so Matt quit almost 2 years ago. Matt stopped making comics. And part of it was he managed to hurt his hand and he couldn't draw for a month. And he stopped feeling anxious and frustrated and annoyed. And he's sort of like, I don't think I'm going to make comics anymore. And January this year, he started posting a little Instagram comic that he's just sort of making and improvising and putting up a panel a week, just doing it that way. And it's because I've done the same thing. I was writing through my 20s trying to get comics made, and there was a point where I just stopped writing because it was just always such an uphill battle for me. I just couldn't handle it anymore, and I stopped. And the thing is that if you want to make comics, if you want to create something, the basic thing is, like, for me, making comics is hard. It's a headache. It's frustrating. There's a ton of anxiety that goes into it. There's all this stuff, and it sounds terrible. Like, running a Kickstarter, my wife realizes that I am going to be hell to live with for actually about a month and a half. I am not the man she loves. I am the man she tolerates existing in her life. But for all of that, it's so much better than not making comics. Because not making comics, if you have something inside of you, it's your duty to put it out in the world. Because you might be the only one having to say it that way. You might be able to connect with somebody that moves your idea to the next stage. Your idea might not be the big one. It might not change the world. But it might be the idea that changes the mind of the mind that will change the world. It might be something. And it's a real waste when you don't. I will sit down and work with people. I love working with people creatively because that's the whole purpose of my life and how I'm working is just, I want to make cool shit with cool people. And that's what it's about for me, from my perspective.
Yeah. I've been making games now for 20 years, and the vulnerability and security frustration is real. But doing music, which is a recent endeavor, which is, outside the confines of an employer, you're just doing it for yourself, and it's your name on it, and it is just you.
Yeah.
With collaborators, but it's your thing, and it is. You do wonder sometimes, why am I doing this?
Yes.
All the time. Like, why am I subjecting myself to this? But then the thought of not doing it seems like
so much worse.
Is so much worse. It's almost like you're trapped. Like you have to do it.
Oh no, it's
like you get to do it, but you also have to do it.
Yeah, it's I have friends who are like, yeah, some people just can't make it in comics. But there are some people who can't make it without it. Like, I mean, I have one person that I'm working with, and she even admits that comics are what saved her life, and her work is her work is not for everybody, but for the people her work is for, it will save lives. It's an artist by the name of Laurence de Dion, and she does some fantastic work. But the thing is that her work started, for her, comics was her way out of depression. She was working as a teacher and hating it. And as somebody who's had tons of terrible teachers in their lives, as soon as you are a teacher and you hate it, you should be quitting. So that's, which is hard because it's a nice, stable, not well paying, but stable job that's unionized. You don't have to worry about things. But if you're hating it, you're going to ruin some kid's life, possibly. Because, like, I've worked in schools, and I actually worked as a teacher's aide working with special needs kids. And it was both the best job and the worst job you could possibly have in so many ways, because on a great day, it's fantastic because this kid has made an advancement in their lives. They're happy, they're doing well, they've had a great day, and you were a part of it. On an average day, is actually a great day in any other job because you're getting to help and work with this kid who probably has this amazing personality to them and is just so full of love and life. But on the bad days, it's awful because you just feel like you come out of the day and you just ruined this kid's day because everything that you've tried to do to help them get through the day was the wrong thing for them that day. And those days can destroy you. And if those days start piling up over even your average days, it's going to wear you down.
Mm-hmm.
So for her, making comics saved her life. Mm-hmm. And now she's making comics that will save lives. So,
yeah, I think, when you still work elsewhere, you're doing the thing you love, you're making it, but you still have this full-time job. It's fine. Yeah. It's great. Like, having a job is great. It doesn't have to be your life's work. It just can be the thing that enables your life's work. But at some point, there's a signal that it's time to do something else. That it's just like, as stable as it is, as much as you should keep the job, not that you should just quit, but that you should start figuring out, like, if it drains you of all the energy and you can't do the other thing that you love because of this job, you have to decide what your priorities are. And if your priority is making this other thing and having headspace for that, it's time to change the day job up. It's an interesting challenge.
Yeah, no, I was fortunate. I was laid off from my last job, and just with the way things are between my wife and I, she makes enough money that we're covered for the most part. And Montreal is a cheap enough cost of living city that, like, I have comic creator friends who've said that they wouldn't be able to maintain a career if not for the cost of living in Montreal.
Mm-hmm. And not to mention, you have health coverage. Part of that. Montreal's a great city, and Quebec in general is a great place to be a creative.
Yeah, and a parent.
Daycare.
My daycare costs a month what it costs a week in most places across North America.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think we paid $170 something last month for daycare.
Yeah, so I think there are, like, what's interesting there is there's some structural components to making art.
Yeah.
So is a priority for you to go make your thing, then maybe living in the Bay Area is not the place you want to be. Maybe New York City is not the place you want to be. Maybe you need to make some structural changes to your life to reduce costs, to be in a better situation to then be able to make art. And And that's
Brian Lee O'Malley moved from Toronto to Halifax while he was making Scott Pilgrim. Because he couldn't live off of making comics in Toronto, so he had to move to Halifax.
but he could in Halifax.
Yeah, and actually he lived even outside of Halifax. I would not be able to do what, like, I could make Conceptual Heist, I could keep going on with my partner, because I mean, actually that was one of the other things that sort of skipped over. Jenny, my current partner, the reason she joined in on Conceptual Heist was she was actually our first clear on hard fan of Conceptual Heist for Matt and I. She was the first person that signed up for Patreon, and I was like, I don't know who this is. Matt, do you know who this is? No. We have a paying fan.
That's amazing.
And and I had gotten to know her online, and we were chatting on a fair amount, and she was drawing some comics for Antarctic Press and that. And when Matt quit, I started reaching out to all sorts of different people. I reached out to her, and she's like, well, I'd love to, but I'm not available until June. And I'm like, okay. And then COVID hit, and everything sort of fell apart. I got to spend 3 months just being a dad alone and not having a comic coming out or anything, which was a lot of anxiety. But at the same time, I got to spend 3 months just being a dad. And that actually helped reset a lot of the priorities, because a lot of my priority has been get the comic going, keep the comic going, keep it doing all that energy. But having the comic fall apart on me and having Matt quit was actually one of the better things in a lot of ways, because it made me refocus, realize that I had to sort of stretch out and get other partners, other people to work with, make sure I had other projects and not just focus on that one. Because while I had been trying to do other things, that was more back burner, and Conceptual Heist was on the front burner. And without Conceptual Heist, I didn't have a selling point for people to come in. And then all of a sudden, I'm just being a dad. And it helps remind me that I wanted to be a writer for the longest time, because I liked the idea of being home for my kids. That if I'm working from home, my kids will come home from school and I'm there.
Yeah.
I'm available as a parent. And when I started working from home, my wife instituted a hard 5 o'clock workday is done. Like, as long as our son's home, I'm not supposed to be working. That doesn't always work. But since COVID, both of us have sort of fallen on that, because she's gotten very bad because she's working from home now. But I mean, I write because I want to be able to be a dad, because I realized being a dad was my primary job. Being a writer is my secondary job. It's the job that brings me a lot of fun and excitement and sort of go to in a lot of things. And it's also the thing that gets me out of the house, oddly enough. Or at least it did before, when I was allowed to get out of the house.
You also don't know.
I have no idea where I was going anymore.
Yeah, no, it's fine. You also don't know, like, so I see that you're in this like cycle of putting out books with Conceptual Heist. You're in this just content treadmill.
Yeah.
But you just never know at any point it's going to get optioned for something, or it's going to get discovered some way, or pop, or
so we've been poked at for being optioned. I don't know where the poking is. It sort of faded off.
As things do.
But yeah, I don't stress about it.
Yeah.
because I would rather have Conceptual Heist not be optioned than to have it optioned by the wrong person.
Mm-hmm. And it ends up this whole other thing.
Yeah.
That doesn't resemble what you made.
Yeah. It's one of the things that sort of made me sort of click on that in my head was for 17, 18 years, the top 2 graphic novels were Batman Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen. And it was basically one year, one would be the number 1 graphic novel sold that year, and the other one would be number 2. And then the next year they'd swap. That would just go back and forth every year. But the thing is that, and then the comic markets shifted and started focusing on trade paperbacks a lot more. But one of the things that happened was that Dark Knight and Watchmen were still selling pretty much standard. They knew what print run they needed for those books every year. You could note it as that was basically running like clockwork. And then the Watchmen movie came out. And the Watchmen graphic novel stopped selling as well. And then they did an animated Batman Dark Knight movie.
Yeah.
And Dark Knight Returns stopped selling as well. So in a lot of ways, it's sort of like, if you have this top-selling graphic novel, maybe you don't want to sell the rights.
That's true. Yeah.
Because even a decent movie adaptation doesn't necessarily mean the sales will be there. I think the only one that's actually managed to pay off for over the long run, as far as I know, is The Walking Dead, which I think was interesting in a lot of ways because if you've read The Walking Dead and you watched the TV series, the first 2 episodes read very much like the first 2 issues of the comic. And then you get to the 3rd episode and it reads very differently from the 3rd issue of the comic. And if you look at who wrote the 3rd issue of the the 3rd episode, it's actually Robert Kirkman who came in and changed where the story was going to go in the TV series.
I see. And that way they're not duplicate. There's a reason to get both.
Yeah.
That's smart.
Yeah. So you'll get hints, and the same thing's happening with the Invincible TV series. It's not exactly the same. They're changing things up in very interesting ways. And I'm very curious as to how that series is going to go, because it's not running the same way. So if you're like, if anybody wants to option Conceptual Heist, I want them to do a good adaptation inspired by the comic. I don't want you doing the same thing as the comic, because I want same style, same sort of concept, art heist, outer space, space station, and then run it a different way.
Yeah, I did a project with Marvel, and it was very similar, where they didn't want the gaming universe to cross over with the cinematic universe or the comic universe. They saw those as separate things that existed kind of in their own metaverse. And I think that that's important. It allows each medium to do what it needs to with the IP without worrying about stepping on the toes of other people. It's interesting that fans can keep up with that too, that they understand. These are different things.
Yeah, and like, I understand, because I have that sort of geek mindset of, well, this never happened in the comics. No. I'm like, it doesn't matter if it happened in the comics or not. This is not the comics, this is the movie.
Yeah.
The comics are the comics, the movies are the movies. 9 times out of 10, the comics could be 1,000 times better than the movie ever could be. Because Captain America Civil War was not what it should have been.
Yeah,
it was just a...
I think that, like you said, in comics, like the reader will fill in gaps and kind of remember it a certain way, and it means something special to each individual. Whereas cinematic, I think there's less of that space, although it can be there, depending on the director. I feel like the Marvel movies are pretty on the nose. Like there's not
Yeah.
a lot of space in those movies to imagine.
No.
And I think that it's hard to have ownership or agency over
Well,
something like that.
it's the what does the monster look like thing. Part of the reason why you never get to see the monster in any monster movies is horror movies don't get much of a budget to play with. So you never get to see the monster because they don't have the effects budget for it. So you get one shot of the monster at the end of the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Marvel has the budget for showing you everybody in the galaxy coming to fight Thanos at the same time.
It's true. Okay, I have one last question for you. So let's say you talk to somebody who wants to go make a comic or be a writer, be an artist, and they're having a really hard time taking that next step and just doing it. What is the advice that you give to them?
Yeah, by Thursday to get your next page out.
Give them a deadline.
The deadlines have been, and actually announce it online. Tell people online, Thursday next week, first page of my new comic series. Do it. Run. You want to write a novel? Post your daily page. Post how many words you wrote that day. Every day, while you're writing the book, this many words done. And you'll start getting people who will cheer you on. And people who will say, like, when you have a 400-word day, and you say, I only got 400 words done. If you've been doing 10,000, it's sort of like, okay, yeah, I see you only got 4,000 words done. You got 10,000 words done yesterday. We'll let you off, but you have to go bigger tomorrow. Like, yeah, okay, first page of my comic is next week. And the next page has to be the week after, and the week after. There's a lot of different mentalities on it. But if you're going to start and build your audience, you start now. And
I love that.
There are people who will say that set up, make sure you are ahead of the deadline. And I'm like, no, let the train run you over if you're going to miss it. Just keep running. Don't worry about the deadline. Don't worry about having lead time. Don't worry about any of this. Just, I'm a Mikey ad. I'm a Nike ad. Just do it.
Yep, for sure.
Just run.
I think social accountability is a great tool, putting yourself out there, announcing it, telling people who are going to hold you accountable. I think that we all need that external person kind of pushing us. That's great.
But here's the thing. It's not even necessarily, people will only start calling you out if you don't do it. If you don't do it when you've been doing it for a while. Because if you say, oh, my next comic, I'm starting a webcomic and it launches next Thursday. And if next Thursday it's not up, nobody's going to call you. Nobody's going to care. But you'll know you failed. And you get to live with that. And failure is a great
I think the realization there is either I didn't do it because, well, honestly, as long as the scope of the work is reasonable, the only reason you don't do it is because it's not really a priority for you. And even if it gets you to that point where you know that it's not a priority, I think that's okay. At least you know. And you're not going to pretend that it is anymore. Hey, Jay, we're at the end here. I wanted to thank you for coming on. Anyone who's watching Conceptual Heist.
Conceptual Heist at conceptualheist.com or look on Webtoons. I'm JDC, JAYDICI on Twitter and Instagram, and you can follow us over on Patreon at patreon.com/conceptualheist. And actually for the month of June, we are running our annual, although we haven't done it in 2 years, Patreon event, which we call June Madness. So every day for the month of June at the $2 level, You're getting every single post that we have up. And we are actually, all of our new donations that we get for June and our July earnings on Conceptual Heist are actually going to be going to local charities or Canadian charities. We're going for Black Lives Matters and some Indigenous charities, because both Jenny and I are big supporters of making sure things are even. We did the same thing last year. We didn't make any kind of announcement for it except to our Patreon backers, but this year we're sort of saying, no, this year if you join in, your money is going to be going to some very specific places, especially as of when we're recording this. This weekend, 215 bodies were found at a Indigenous school. Now I'm forgetting the name of the schools, which makes me feel terrible. But
residential schools.
Yeah, the residential schools. Mass grave of 215 bodies were found. So Jenny and I are both big believers that these are things that need to be faced and dealt with. One of the characters in Conceptual Heist is a character named Knox, who's a old black man with a great big giant white afro. And the thing is that the character Knox is inspired by... I wanted to do a kids comic at the same time I was creating Conceptual Heist. And I asked a friend of mine, Neldy, if I could use his son as inspiration for one of the characters in the kids comic. And he's like, yeah. And then the kids comic fell through at the time. And I felt bad because his son was super hyped that he was going to be a comic book character. So I just turned his son, who was like just a few years old when Conceptual Heist was starting, and put him up. So it's all of a sudden this 80-year-old man in 2090 is actually, and
that's cool.
The real world Knox is like, he has no interest in aging up technology or anything, because he knows what he's going to look like when he's 80. He's going to look like that guy.
That's funny.
Yeah. He's going to be an 80-year-old man with a giant white afro, a nice suit, 2 cybernetic arms, and Blue Label Johnny Walker.
That's cool. Well, I appreciate your heart and your activism there.
Yeah.
It's super important. And
yeah.
Well,
we'll keep do what you can.
Yeah. We'll put all the links in the show notes on both YouTube
and
on the podcast so people can follow up. But I appreciate you coming on. I thank you. You can
Thank you very much.
We'll hang up after we hang up here. But
okay.
Cool.
It. All
right. Thanks.
Bye. Bye.